welcome back to the darker side of the after show. This is for episode number 7. Who is Roberto Medina? I'm joined by my good pal Lukey, who is on to cover this episode. And I always ask Lukey first and foremost about his initial reactions to this episode. And I am really keen to hear you in a moment, Lukey, but I just cannot fathom how this story hasn't really gained the level of popularity in an era where true crime is at its highest in terms of the consumption of, the type of documentaries that are out there on like Netflix and things of that nature. It seems to be at its sort of highest consumption rate in terms of what people want to hear and see. And yet this story it's been told a couple of times by various different outlets, but we've done an in-depth podcast here, Lukey, where we've gone through every little detail we could manage to source for it, and we've got all this information and all these questions that remain unanswered with this episode in terms of Roberto Medina. But ultimately, it's a story that I know you weren't too familiar with, so I'm always curious to know how you've interpreted this individual and the things that happen throughout this individual's life.
Boxing attracts some strange people. Very, I'll put it like this. I was in a boxing gym this week. There's no need to say what one. And you look around the room and listening to this story, I go, is there one guy in this room that's going to turn out with a crazy type of story? That's where my mind is that boxing, unlike any other sport, has some really strange stories and really strange characters.
Roberto Medina was a strange character indeed. We covered this episode, Luke. We talked about his origins. We talked about how he essentially used a new name, as in Roberto Medina, to be able to forge a new path in his life, having had some earlier transgressions throughout the course of his early to late teenage years. And it seems like at the time when you go through the timeline of his story that he turns his life around for a good period of time. I mean, he's in the St. Pete's Boxing Club for a long period of time. He's seen as a role model to kids. They don't really question his past. They leave his past behind him. And it's only because of that one particular incident where he fights Meldrick Taylor when he's up and coming, where he's actually then noticed by police because of a tip by a disgruntled ex-partner of Roberto Medina's. So the fact that he gets to this level where he fights an Olympian in Meldrick Taylor is really the pinnacle of Roberto Medina's boxing career per se. But it's that moment that actually his past does come back to haunt him. And from there on out, I think it is really a downward slope for him because we go through this timeline of Roberto Medina having this issue, coming outside of the ring, then he's getting involved in things that he shouldn't be getting involved in, and then there's reports of him then in the 90s being charged for a bank robbery, yet there was 6 bank robberies committed in the same fashion in and around the same area at the same time, but yet he was only charged for one of those. And then when you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, all of a sudden this report gets surfaced about a retrospective attempted murder and sexual assault on a woman in the late 1980s. It turns out Roberto Medina was the person that committed this crime at that time. And then I think what gets even worse about the whole story is then he is then in the area around the same time where 2 old age pensioners are subsequently murdered in the same fashion, in the same MO, and Roberto Medina never gets charged for any of them, although one of the detectives on the case actually goes on telly and says, we've got our guy, it's Roberto Medina, and he actually puts him outright out there as the guy that did it, but he was never convicted of those particular crimes. So that, in a snapshot, is kind of the timeline of Roberto Medina, and it's a lot to digest, but going through all this, what did you make of these incidents, his life, the murders, the attempted murder that he was charged for as well, the sexual assault? Did it make you then automatically point to his direction when these other murders were uncovered, or did you think it could have just been coincidence? I mean, I'm really curious to know how you interpret these types of things that go on.
So I skew to a negative typically, as you probably know, because now that you know me so well, you go, "How are you feeling?" Which typically means you skew to the negative. People don't ask people that are genuinely happy all the time that. Um, I don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe things just randomly happen. I think that that's called a pattern. And I think that this is very concerning that something egregious and awful had happened and then it popped up around him. And it seems like there was a lot of suspicion. Once again, selfishly, I'll just speak to my own experience. Listening to this story made me wonder how many Roberto Medinas are in the gym. And though boxing is having a positive outlook on their life, how many people in the gyms that I'm in might turn into a Roberto Medina, or these type of stories carry on, and that this is, even though this is a story we've heard, how prevalent is this story in the boxing community is what my mind kind of went to.
I think what's concerning about this whole story is that it now makes you question whether or not, like you say, you could be around a certain amount of boxers on a weekly basis, like yourself, when you're doing your different projects. And it can really make you wonder, like, what type of past have some of these guys got? Because let's be honest, unless you get to know them personally and spend time with them personally outside of the projects that maybe you're involved in, how well do you really know these people? I mean, it's quite scary to think that someone like a Roberto Medina was able to get by for a number of years, and as I said earlier, was looked up to like an idol. And then his past really didn't come to the forefront until a few years down the line. It's the art of deception. Essentially, he deceived so many people. And I think what was crazy as well was that even after he'd been arrested for escaping prison, and because he'd built up such a good reputation with people and he had not essentially committed a crime since he'd escaped from prison, people helped him get out of prison earlier. They campaigned for him to get out of prison because all they saw was him at that time and not the guy he once was. So he was ultimately helped to be freed from prison and his jail sentence slightly cut as a result of people in his life at the time helping him do that. And then when you hear later on down the line the crime he does go on to commit, which is dealt with retrospectively, then you think, look at what all those people did for him, and then look at how much of a piece of shit he becomes as a result of people going into that art of deception, being deceived by somebody like him, who ultimately goes on to commit a horrendous crime, goes on to commit further crimes, and then is potentially being put down as a suspect for even more heinous crimes. And I mean, I don't really believe in coincidences either, but it's hard to really sit here and say on an episode that, you know, this is the guy that's done it, because we haven't got evidence to suggest that he has. But the information and the MOs and the patterns, as you rightly pointed out, it's very eerily similar to what he was doing and what he was actually convicted for previously. Although his victim wasn't murdered, he stopped. He didn't carry on. He kind of got startled, gets out of there, doesn't fully carry out what potentially he may have carried out on other people, and it's scary. And it's scary to think that there is a lot of people within the sport of boxing now that, do we really know who they are?
Well, and I think that you hit on two things, and one thing why I enjoy being on this show so much, and now I'm doing the Sergio Mora thing, and it's probably because I look up to Sergio, where I'm putting over the host when I come on the platform, but is that we're both fact-based people. So a lot of people might word fight with you, lip wrestle with you, say a bunch of words, but I don't want to condemn someone if the facts aren't there. I'm just going to simply, like you said, if there's a pattern and it's a coincidence, let's take that into account. Let's not condemn and convict, but that's something that we need to say, hey, that could have happened. I've been saying this for a long time, and I don't feel like people listen to me. Boxing attracts some people who are really strange, some people who could be serial killers, some people who are very violent, some people who maybe don't have empathy for other people can find themselves in the sport of boxing. And those people tend to figure out a way to slip through the cracks. Serial killers don't get caught easily without modern technology because they go to work. They're anonymous. They don't stand out. What I'm basically saying is boxing allows some weird individuals to hide in plain sight.
It does. And I think it kind of takes us a little bit away from Roberto Medina for a moment, and it kind of focuses on this whole conversation around what boxing can actually facilitate at times. Look at the show that we're covering. Look at what me and Johnston do for the main show. I mean, this is our third season. We're coming towards the end of it. But essentially, by the time we've finished this third season, there's around 36 different stories, 36 different episodes, where you can probably say more than half of them stories surround somebody within the boxing world that has been facilitated by this sport in some way, shape, or form, and then has ended up going on to either be sort of untimely, go through an untimely demise, or they've actually committed a heinous crime. And then when you look at it like that, it really attests to what you're saying and what I'm agreeing with you on, which is boxing is facilitating some strange characters within it, and we truly don't know unless you can sit and live with this individual and be around this individual 24/7. We can never truly know who these people really are. And it's only when something happens like this, like a story like Roberto Medina's, where you'll sit back and go, whoa, hang on a minute. What the hell's gone on here? Look at all the cases we've covered over the years. There's been some really high profile, prolific cases. Going back to season one, Arturo Gatti. You look at Carlos Monzon's case in the late 80s. You look at the fact that we had Edwin Valero's case as well during the 2000s. I think it's eerily very scary that boxing really does facilitate a lot of these people. And, it makes you then wonder, well, what would have happened to these people if they were not in boxing? Would they have then gone on to commit crimes anyway? You just don't know, but it really does get the brain and the thought process working about it. But putting it like that, Lukey, when you say 36 episodes, 36 stories, the majority of them are regarding characters like a Roberto Medina or worse, it's quite a scary fact, isn't it?
Well, and what I wanted to bring up too is how many people do we excuse behavior you and me wouldn't excuse in the workplace because they're a boxer? Hector Camacho doing Camacho time, macho time. Like if he did that at work, you'd be like, dude, this guy's gonna get fired. If someone's yelling and saying all this crazy stuff, like I think the world of Bullet Rolly's coach, but he says murder, 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 kill, kill, kill. This is a saying he does when they're training in boxing. There's a lot of things in boxing that we look at as, okay, this is a way to cause motivation, get you amped up, because what you're doing is you're going to war. People never think about boxing as war, but I think the reason most fighters have a father in their corner is they're basically being led to war, to do battle, to fight for their family's honor and to change their life. We often overlook the obvious, which are the social cues of how we would view anyone outside of a boxing gym, because what we're doing is we're willingly becoming participants in post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is the life we've chose. But I do grapple with this because I think in my empathy to understand the plight of a boxer, I often overlook the obvious of this dude is really strange.
Well, you look at how many lives boxing has saved. It's definitely saved more lives than what it's created or facilitated individuals like a Roberto Medina over the years. But because of the narrative of the show, it just seems strange, doesn't it? It seems strange when you really sit back and think about it, how many characters within this sport have gone on to do something bad, do something potentially evil within their lives. And it is quite scary. But then you've got to try and balance that out, because how many lives does boxing save? It really does save a hell of a lot more lives than it does facilitate those individuals to go on and commit these crimes. And you think about it, what these crimes are really heinous crimes. Like Roberto Medina's crimes were pretty heinous. So would he have done that anyway? Well, yeah, because the story tells us that. We found this information from really before he became a boxer about what he was doing. So he was always going to go down that route, and boxing didn't really save him. It might have temporarily put that hold on the type of person he was, and maybe he thought he could change into a better person. And ultimately, his demons, his inner demons, that inner evil within him, came out again when an opportunity presented itself. So I think there are characters out there that get into this sport, they try to make a change for the better. For the majority of the time, it works for fighters, and they do go on. They earn a decent amount of money, and they can go forward and live their lives. Some of them don't earn a decent amount of money and go into a normal, regular 9 to 5 job. But that doesn't mean they go out and commit a crime like that. What happens is you get these types of individuals with no consciences, with no empathy, with this terrible upbringing or quite bad upbringing, which has sort of led them to go and make these really poor choices in life. And there's some that just go to the extreme of committing these really heinous crimes. And I think what we're trying to sort of put out there is that boxing does facilitate some really good things within it, but then it also has that minority of individuals that get within it that try to make a better life for themselves, but ultimately they just cannot shake who they are as an individual. And I suppose what I'm asking to you now is like, can boxing really change a bad person? Can it really do it?
Yes, because I've seen it. I've seen it work more often than not. But the person that I'm always most, I wouldn't say afraid of because I'm not afraid of things, right? Because I don't allow terrorism or fear to dictate my life. I live on my own terms and I don't let people bully me. That being said, the person that I find the most troubling are the people that enter boxing with the mindset of, I want to beat someone up or I want to hurt someone. Those are the people that genuinely come, and a lot of people say things like that, but they grapple with it in their own head, right? So they'll say I want to hurt someone, but a lot of it's projecting their own inner fears onto, I don't want to get beat up. There are some people that come into the sport that kind of have this really bully mentality, and those people tend to be the hardest to change because they're not interested in the science of the sport. They're interested in being respected, putting fear into others. And there's not really like a happy ending in that because this is a sport that has a beginning, middle, and end. And the end is never really like you at the top being this feared person. It's typically you coming down from the mountain. And that tends to spiral those type of guys into a strange third act.
So when we say actions speak louder than words, then when it comes down to this sport, you've got people like Deontay Wilder, who's a good example of somebody who would openly go on a radio show or a podcast and sit there and say, "I want a body on my record," and what he's saying is he wants to kill somebody in the ring,
But
and
I think
that's
that's fear. I think that's fear with him.
but I don't think he's a bad guy. That's the thing. I don't see him as a bad guy because I see that as that is his facade. Whereas there's some people, and I think it's more the strong, silent types that are the more ones I worry about. Like the ones that
Yes.
wouldn't necessarily say these things, but ultimately you can see it within them. The body language tells you this. You can see by the way they're actively trying to continue to hurt the other individual. It goes past the point of sport and it becomes to the point where this man is or woman is single-handedly trying to kill this person in the ring. And you've seen fights like this. I've seen them. I've seen these fights where you think, oh my god, this person is relentless. And you can't sit there and say, oh well, it's the emotion of the fight. Sometimes there are moments where you think, wow, hang on a minute, why is this person really trying to inflict so much punishment on an individual? And I suppose people's perception of boxing is different. I mean, boxers themselves can even sit there and say, "Well, why do you get in this hurt business if you're not willing to get hurt?" And you get comments like that from people, but then you get those that are in it for the art form of what boxing is all about, is to hit and not be hit. So, what what attracts people to it? Is it just sheer violence? Is it people that are attracted to violence want to be within a violent setting and a violent sport? Is that why you see those people in like MMA and this bare knuckle that's taken off as well? You know, like the bare knuckle sort of leagues and stuff that are taken off. To me, that's just sheer violence. That's just violent people wanting to be violent. I don't understand I feel like the art form goes away when you start to go into something like a bare knuckle. And I'm not going to say MMA is an example of that, because it's not, because there is a lot of skill involved within MMA because of the different techniques and the different disciplines that you have to learn to be an MMA fighter. But I see something like a bare knuckle come along, and I think, well, that's just promoting people that maybe can't be successful within boxing, but are really violent individuals that want to actually inflict that level of punishment on somebody.
I think alone is alone. And I think that's the big thing is I think boxing, MMA, bare knuckle, it we all, at least most people that get into boxing, whether you're media or the fighters, something had to have not worked in life. You don't willingly come into a fringe sport that's so messed up. So, like, if you're a boxer, something didn't work in your life, right? There's other sports you could do that something didn't work. If you're doing bare knuckle, something really didn't work. Doing MMA, something didn't work. Boxing is never really plan A. And if it's plan A, you're probably cuckoo, right? Because it's like it might not work. And what's the backup plan? So, I mean, I think that that's the big issue is to do this, you have to be so delusional because it's not really achievable. And it's one of the hardest things to not just go through, but to witness as someone that loves people that are actively competing in the sport. It's one of the most draining things that's ever happened to my life is to watch people I care about get beat up and there's nothing I can do about it.
So we're going off tangent a little bit because we're talking about boxing in general now, but the whole story of Medina really just sits into the whole conversation about how boxing has some really strange characters in it, and he's certainly one of them, and he certainly goes in that list of very violent people who maybe used this art form and this sport to be able to facilitate that violence. Because you look at the crimes that he committed, and I know I've gone on about this a couple of times, but he's committed some serious crimes there, and yet this guy is a lot. He's an old man now, but he's out, he's free, he's living his life, and yet he's was able to commit various heinous crimes. And when we had this episode a couple of weeks ago, when we talked about Tim Doc Anderson serving life, and life in that particular state means life with no parole, like you see these different types of crimes that happen, and people are allowed to sort of come out, and then you see people like Tim, who kind of was, by every single person's account, was a nice individual, never really had a bad bone in his body type guy, and that's what all the people around said about him. Yet he had this moment of madness where he felt compelled to do something like he did with the Rick Parker incident, and yet it sent him down for life. But then you get people like Roberto Medina, who's clearly been bad to the bone from day one, and yet he commits some relatively heinous crimes, but he's allowed to live life as a free man, even at his later stage of his life. It doesn't make no sense to me, like how these things can be so contrasting with different individuals. It really doesn't.
Oftentimes we sit here and go, well, boxing doesn't make sense. Boxing doesn't make sense compared to other sports. I'd say life doesn't make sense. And part of why I'm drawn to boxing is because of how little life makes sense to me. And I've just embraced that. And I think this story basically shows that life isn't fair. All things are not equal.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it, really, with this particular episode, and this particular character that we are covering for this after show. And I'm interested to always hear the thoughts of others. So everybody that listens to the main show and this after show, it's always really interesting to hear from you. It's like when we talked about the Tim Anderson story in particular, someone dropped a comment on YouTube about how in certain states, as we were talking about in that episode, how certain states will say life in prison without parole, and that's kind of what happened to Tim Anderson. That's why he's still there. But I never can understand that. And then you get characters like this guy, is in Roberto Medina, who really didn't achieve anything as such in his boxing career. His claim to fame is obviously fighting Meldrick Taylor and then getting arrested after it, and then all this other stuff being uncovered. But you just get some really contrasting characters within this sport, and I think that's kind of the theme the overarching theme of what this episode has been about. Whilst we've touched on the story of Roberto Medina and some of the bad things that he's done, what it's really led to is a conversation about how boxing really can attract the most strangest of characters within it, and sometimes they don't always go noticed, and they can go unnoticed for a certain period of time until something really bad happens. I mean, there's certain people that we're yet to cover, which probably people have said, "Oh, why have you not covered this yet?" There's certain people we're yet to cover on this show, which we plan to, and you just think, these people are just absolutely despicable individuals. But yet, before all this, you wouldn't have known any the wiser that these people were that way. And it is absolutely crazy how it can just take something, one incident, one moment, one bad piece of luck in their lives that'll change their perspective forever, and it'll lead them to go and commit really bad crimes, and then end up in this position where they're just being publicized by some and glorified by others.
I mean, it's tricky, right? Because the way the algorithms work for your channels, right? If you made a show called The Gooder Side of Boxing, The Brighter Side of Boxing, how fewer people will listen because they don't want to hear stories of good because they're trying to live a life of good. The sad thing is, our deepest, darkest secrets tend to be what we want to listen to because it's the life we choose not to live. It's the things we don't want. And I think that the problem is oftentimes in boxing, we put the microscope on the bad. And what I appreciate about this program is you're telling this story, but you're not glamorizing this story. You're keeping it $100. You're keeping it one big dollar bill flat, and you're being honest with the people. You're telling the death and the depression and all of that. And I think that that's the tough part with social media content is people and the consumer tend to jump to the crap or the bad stuff and not the substance, because the substance takes time and people want to consume it like fast food. I eat it and then I get through it. And that's just a product of this environment.
It is, and I think the thing with what we do and what you assist us with doing is trying to sort of bring this an informative and factual based show. Like, rather than sit here and I mean, Johnston at times can get quite passionate and quite emotional. That's him as an individual, and he can drop a few swear words into the show, and he doesn't necessarily mean to do that, but it just his emotion takes over, and that's because of his morals. He's a good individual human being, and because of that, when you get a story about an individual like a Roberto Medina or previously like a Tony Ayala, they're really difficult stories to present because you wind up sort of really despising these individuals, and the show isn't about glamorizing what these people have done. It's never been about glamorizing it. It's about informing people. Like, you love this sport, you follow this sport, you see what goes on. Do you really know what goes on sometimes behind the scenes and outside of the ring? How the other side of this life works in the sport? And I think this is kind of why we started it out. We love true crime ourselves and we love this sport. And to bring the two together kind of gives you these moments, this taboo content where people are listening to it thinking, "Oh, he was a bad guy," or "he was a terrible individual." But at the same time, you're compelled by it because you're thinking, what was going through these people's minds when these things were happening? And I think that's kind of the intrigue for me as a human being is like, I wonder why like these people did this stuff. What compelled them to do it, and why did they want to do it? And that's because I'm just a normal average human being with normal average morals who can't really fathom what goes into the mindset of some of these individuals. So it is always good to cover this because you're doing it from a perspective where you try to be objective and not glamorize anybody involved. If anything, you want to actually make sure that the victims' names are never left out, and the people that have been subjected to some of these crimes are no longer with us. They're not forgotten about, because as time goes on, they do get forgotten about, unfortunately. And I think that's one of the other things we like to do is make sure that the victims of those individuals, and i.e. Roberto Medina in this instance, don't get forgotten about. Their names get mentioned. That's why it's important for us to do that. We could sit there and do, yeah, Roberto Medina sexually assaulted some individual, or Roberto Medina was linked to the individual's X and Y. Instead, we get the factual information and we tell people the story and we say, look, these are the victims. These are the victims' names. This is what happens to them. Not to glorify him, but to make sure that they're not forgotten about. So it is very, very important that that stays part and parcel of what we do, because otherwise we'd essentially just be glorifying these individuals, and that's not the aim of the show. And I hope that people listening understand that from our side, and obviously from your side, Lukey. You give a really interesting take on these episodes, because what you do is you are able to then bring this sort of level-headedness and relate some of these moments to your own personal experiences and how you've dealt with these and how you would deal with these situations. And it's always great to get that perspective on things. So a big thank you to you, as always, for bringing that different element to this show. But that's pretty much it for the chat of this episode. And what I wanted to do before we called time on it, Lukey, was just bring to the attention of the listeners what's happening next week. So next week's episode is titled The Life and Crimes of John Morrissey, bare knuckle boxing champion, New York gangster, Irish American politician. Lukey, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you know who John Morrissey is?
No, I know who John Morrison is, and I know who Morrissey, the lead singer of the Smiths, is, but I have no clue. When you put these names together, I have no clue what that means.
So John Morrissey is someone who American historians will look upon in different ways. Some of them look up on him in a favorable way. Some will look upon him as, nah, he wasn't the man he should have been. He's been glamorized. This is the glamorization of someone like him might seem a bit strange to some individuals, but I think what people are in for in this next episode is actually you get the understanding of an Irish immigrant who comes over to America looking for the American dream in the 1800s, and life is just so much different to what it was going into the next century and how things change and the technological developments that change. He lived in a time where literally New York was like the film, and John Morrissey and some of the characters in this story who lived in this time actually inspired that film, Gangs of New York. So, ahead of the next episode, if you haven't heard about John Morrissey's story as yet, and you want to kind of get a feel for what we're going to be telling you with real people involved, go and watch that film again if you've not already seen it, Gangs of New York, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Liam Neeson. It really does give you a feel for what this story is all about when you listen to it. And it is a bumper episode. It's 2.5 hours long, but you want to hear the stories that are in there. It is such a different dynamic to what we've covered before, and it's certainly staying in the theme of this season, which means every single episode is a different theme completely. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to going through it with you, Lukey, because there'll be a bit of American history involved in it, and maybe the stuff that you actually don't know in here. Maybe the stuff you already know, which I think will be really good. So I'm looking forward to that next week. I hope everybody else looks forward to it. Lukey, I'm just going to give you a final say then on Roberto Medina. But just before we end this episode, just kind of sum it up as quickly as you can. Like, Roberto Medina in your mind?
I'll end it philosophically. We always remember the perpetrator. We never remember the victim. We always remember the serial killer. We don't remember those that were the victims of the circumstance of it. And I think that's a shame.
Absolutely. And it just bleeds into what I was saying earlier about the fact that we make sure them victims' names, if possible, can be talked about and mentioned, because it's so important they don't get forgotten about. And I hope that people really do understand and can kind of resonate and respect that. That is exactly why we do it. Not to glamorize our podcast, not to get extra views. We actually do it because at the end of the day, these people were victims of crimes. And it's important that they get recognized as individuals and human beings that once walked the same planet you did. So there you go, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do let us know on social media at darker_side_pod, or you can find us on any other platform at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. If you want to follow Lukey in ITR Boxing, you can do that by following him at Lukey Boxing on Twitter, or subscribe to ITR Boxing's YouTube channel. Go and see all the great content Lukey's doing. And if you want to go even one step further, go to the OnlyFans account for ITR Boxing, doing some really good premium content and documentaries on there. And that is everything for this episode. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this episode of The Darker Side of the After Show.